The UK government says it remains absolutely committed to peace in Ukraine and that it's engaging with key allies after President Trump paused US military aid to the war-torn country. A short while ago, the EU Commission President outlined her plan to strengthen Europe's military capability, saying it would help the bloc get immediate military equipment to Ukraine. An official in Washington explained President Trump's decision by saying, "The president's been clear that he's focused on peace. We need our partners to be committed to that goal as well. We're pausing and reviewing our aid to ensure that it's contributing to a solution." Well, since returning to the White House, President Trump's claimed on a number of occasions that the Biden administration gave Ukraine $350 billion in military assistance. BBC News has not been able to verify that figure. Well, the US Department of Defense says the amount spent on military assistance to Ukraine in the 3 years since the Russian invasion amounts to just over $180 billion. President Trump's move comes days after that heated exchange between him and President Zelensky and Vice-President Vance in the Oval Office. Well, speaking to Fox News before the military aid was paused, Vice-President Vance said the door is open if Mr Zelensky is willing to talk peace. Mr Vance also suggested that giving Washington an economic interest in the future of Ukraine would serve as a security guarantee.
If you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country and ensure that America has a long-term interest.
JD Vance there. Well, Ukraine does produce some of its own weaponry, but it does rely heavily on billions of dollars of aid from overseas allies such as America and Europe. With more on all of that, here's BBC Verify's Nick Eardley.
What would a reduction in US support look like? And could Europe step in to fill funding and equipment gaps? Let's look at spending, first of all. The US is the biggest individual spender by some margin. This shows all military aid going into Ukraine. In red, the United States. In blue, every other country combined. That is a huge amount of cash for Europe and other countries to find. Very roughly, to keep the same level of spending without the US, every other country would have to double its military support. It's a big ask when there are so many pressures on public spending. For the UK, that's about £2.8 billion extra every year. Then there's equipment. This is a HIMARS rocket launcher. The US has provided 39 of these to Ukraine, according to the Kiel Institute think tank. European countries combined have provided 43 similar systems. There are these long-range ATACMS missiles provided by Washington. There are European alternatives like the British Storm Shadows, but ATACMS have been important for Ukraine's army. And then there's ammunition. A huge volume of artillery has been used in this conflict. The US has sent more than 4.5 million rounds. The EU previously missed its timetable for sending just 1 million. Production in Europe has increased. The EU has promised 2 million rounds in 2025, but some experts have questioned whether that pledge can be met. Now, this is some of the quantifiable support. Remember, some of it isn't, like intelligence assistance. And the debate around support for Ukraine raises other questions about US support for NATO. This was what Elon Musk said over the weekend. He thinks it's time for the USA to leave the alliance, and that would have a huge financial impact. Here we can see NATO member defence spending. In red, the United States. In blue, every other country combined. If the USA reduced or even ended its funding, the impact would be colossal, even as European countries pledge to increase their defence spending.
That's Nick Eardley from BBC Verify there. Well, in Ukraine itself, reports suggest that the country's current stockpile of weapons will last another 6 months. MPs have already been discussing the consequences of America pausing its military aid there. Our Ukraine correspondent is James Waterhouse.
There are ministers calling for calm. There are MPs arguing that if Ukraine is fighting for peace, fighting for its survival, then President Zelensky should just go and sign this mineral deal, should apologise, should give America the repeated thank yous it seems to be calling for, if it's all in the name of Ukraine's continued survival. But this is a political lever that has been most feared. The last time this happened, when American aid was slowed by disagreements in the US Congress, President Zelensky said Ukraine lost lives and land, and there was an eastern town called Avdiivka, which was once a fortress, which fell because Ukrainian soldiers partly ran out of kit that they needed to sustain their attack. If you go to the western border in the country, there are constant convoys of military aid coming in under police escort. They are an artery. They are much needed armour and ammunition needed by exhausted troops to keep fighting this full-scale invasion that Russia exerts. So this has long been feared. Seemingly it could be resolved in a political sense, but at the moment, in the words of one Ukrainian advocacy group, you've got Russia that's been given the green light to keep advancing, which it is in the eastern Donetsk region. You've got these reports of America, exploring a relaxation of sanctions, trying to continue to warm relations with Moscow as it deals directly with Moscow, and all of the levers and pressure is being exerted on Ukraine as it's looking in both directions now.
James Waterhouse in Kyiv there. Well, in the last hour, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has been talking about a new plan to boost military and help Ukraine in the process.
We are in an era of rearmament, and Europe is ready to massively boost its defence spending, both to respond to the short-term urgency to act and to support Ukraine, but also to address the long-term need to take on more responsibility for our own European security.
Lots of reaction, of course, coming in this morning to the news of America suspending military aid to Ukraine. We've also heard from the British government now. The Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, appearing on the BBC's Today programme, speaking to Emma Barnett. This was her reaction. Let's have a listen.
We are focused on support for Ukraine, bringing the US around the table alongside our European partners in Ukraine. We've put our money where our mouth is and stepped up our support for Ukraine through air defence, through military capabilities and through the military aid we give year upon year. And the Prime Minister will not conduct dialogue on open airwaves. He will continue to do what he's done in the last couple of days, which is to bring about that peace. And the US have said consistently that they want to see peace in Ukraine, and the Prime Minister is focused on getting that peace, but also has made it really clear that the peace has to be sustainable with security guarantees, and that's what the Prime Minister's focused on.
That's the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner there. Well, lots to get through. Let's speak to our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, who joins us now. Jeremy, loads to talk about, of course. Let's start with your assessment of how you think what we heard from the White House will change an already complicated picture when it comes to global relations over the war in Ukraine.
Well, first of all, the important thing to recognise is that this is really the most serious crisis in the history of the transatlantic alliance, the transatlantic relationship, since it was formed during and after the Second World War. It is that big. Why is it that big? It's essentially because the Americans are now on an opposite side to the position of the Europeans as expressed in that summit in London over the weekend and subsequently. Of course, people want peace. Everyone will say, yeah, of course I want peace. Countries want peace. But the issue is, what is the price of peace? Is the price of peace, as the Russians have said, essentially Ukrainian capitulation? And the Americans appear to be sharing a lot of talking points. They're definitely sharing a lot of talking points with the Americans. Or is it the kind of peace that was being talked about by Keir Starmer and others at the weekend as they very openly supported President Zelensky? And that means that the Europeans and the British have been taking a very high-profile role in all of this, are essentially trying to execute an extraordinarily difficult high-wire act. On the one side, there's this support that they have for Ukraine and an offer to put boots on the ground, planes in the air. And on the other side, there's the Americans who've been rather rude about this. I mean, JD Vance's comments overnight where he was saying some countries that have not fought a war for 30 years, he dismissed them. Far better to have American financial interests there. So to try to sustain that high wire act, to somehow keep Trump happy, and at the same time not sell Ukraine down the river, that might actually be impossible.
And Jeremy, as we look at what is potentially, as you say, an impossible situation to work back from, is the only way the US might walk back on some of this if President Zelensky says sorry, because that's what some people have been speculating over, or indeed if he leaves the office?
Well, yeah, it is extraordinary to say, but there was a time until quite recently when American foreign policy was based on a system of alliances where people, of course, America put its own interests first, but where there were also shared interests. Now, the idea is Trump's view, which is America first, which is essentially the rest of the world is raw material for America to do deals, to get richer, to be more powerful. And it's a throwback to big powers in the 19th century when they would get together. The British, of course, were one of those, and just decide things for themselves, send gunboats if necessary, if not, send traders and merchants. And so this is a really difficult, serious crisis, and it may well be the unraveling of that alliance which has lasted for so long.
Indeed, and of course we see European leaders. We saw at the weekend that meeting in London, for example, trying to come up with some sort of plan. We've seen that offer from France as well, and the UK working with them on that. Is that going to have any leverage with the US? Will they sign up to that now?
Well, it's hard to know. Perhaps. I think the action of suspending arms shipments is undoubtedly by the Americans a gambit to try and get Zelensky to the table. But let's assuming he does come to the table. Let's assuming he goes to the White House or to Mar-a-Lago, cap in hand, says to, like a naughty schoolboy, says to JD Vance or Donald Trump, look, I'm terribly sorry for sticking up for myself like that. I won't do it again, won't happen again. And where's that contract? I want to sign it and sign away a lot of mineral rights to the Americans. What happens after that? Because when they get to the table, then the situation may well be, if Vladimir Putin or his people are there, that they will say, look, we've made it very clear what happens. Ukraine needs to be demilitarized. We, the Russians, need to keep territory. Would the Ukrainians, Zelensky or some successor, accept that? Would Europe accept that after everything it's said about protecting Ukraine? There are so many imponderables, but what makes it a lot more difficult to try to solve is there's a great lack of clarity now because of Trump. And you can argue that, in fact, look, what was going on before under Biden wasn't going to work. He gave Ukraine enough weapons not to lose, but not to win either, because he was worried about what the Russians might do. He took their nuclear threat seriously. So Trump supporters would say he's just being realistic. And of course, both sides are going to have to give something. But at the moment, the way the Americans are presenting it, the givers are the Ukrainians and the takers are the Russians and also the Americans, because of course it's quite clear that another big priority of Donald Trump is mending America's relationship with Russia.
Yeah, and Jeremy, you talk about Russia. We're just seeing lines coming into us from the Kremlin, from the Reuters news agency. One here saying if the US stops these supplies, it will be the best contribution to the cause of peace. So Vladimir Putin, presumably watching on with quite a lot of glee, looking at what's been unfolding.
Yeah, I think for Russia, for peace, read victory. This is Christmas every day for them at the moment. This is reflected in the things they put out on social media, the way that the pro-Putin media have been crowing with delight about what's happening. And I've just spent a couple of weeks in Ukraine. I only got back a few days ago. And of course, there's consternation there about what's happening. And also, I have to say, from certainly soldiers I spoke to in areas near the Russian border who had been fighting, for example, in Kursk, which is the area that the Ukrainians took from Russia back in last August. I mean, they're quite defiant. They said, well, they're going to fight on, that drones are now such a big part of the battlefield, and they are, that they can get by. They don't necessarily need what the Americans have got, though they do accept that losing US intelligence, losing air defenses, losing the ammo for these very sophisticated weapons they've been given, and the satellite information they need to acquire targets, all of that is going to be very difficult for them. But they are, I mean, they're building a lot of their own weapons. And I don't think, the thing you have to remember is that for the Ukrainians, this is about existence. It's not about real estate. It's not about, well, maybe we can do a deal, give Putin some land and he'll be satisfied. They believe that Putin will never be satisfied until he's broken Ukrainian independence and sovereignty. And certainly his own writings suggest that is very much what he wants to do.
Jeremy, we're hearing from some Ukrainian politicians that they believe they have enough military supplies, at least for the next 6 months or so. But you were just drawing on your experience, having just returned from Ukraine, and what we've seen in recent days is, a huge number of drone attacks continuing on Ukraine. A reminder, of course, that while all these talks continue, the war continues on. I just wondered if I could get your assessment of how you see things going militarily, I should say, given this news now as well.
Well, without American weapons, it is going to be easier for the Russians, no doubt about it. I mean, while I was in Kyiv, for example, they had their worst, the biggest drone attack they'd had since the start of all this from the Russians. The Russians have also been boasting about that on their own outlets. And, for hours that night in the capital city, you could see searchlights going through the sky, old style anti-aircraft cannon firing tracer up at these drones, and you could hear the drones as well. I mean, I could hear the drones very clearly when I was standing on the roof of our hotel doing lives for the BBC there. So the situation is, though, that both sides are actually very good at this drone warfare now. And the majority of casualties on both sides are being caused now by drones. The shape of the war has changed since it began, when you'll remember there were these lines of tanks and there was old-fashioned heavy artillery going on. It looked rather like World War II or World War I even. It's different now because these drones are transforming things. They're absolutely deadly, and they make even movement on the battlefield incredibly dangerous and difficult.